Cedar Hollow, Texas, 1879. Naomi Carter had said yes to a wedding for every sensible reason a woman could name, and not one of them was love. She told herself that was enough. 3 weeks before the ceremony, a drifting cowboy rode onto her land and found her struggling alone with a frightened horse. He asked a question no one had bothered to ask in 2 years. Naomi already had an answer. She'd been living with it for 2 years. But some questions asked by the right person at the right moment refused to let the old answers survive. Naomi Carter had been talking to the colt for the better part of an hour, and the colt had not yet decided to believe a word of it. I was a 2-year-old chestnut with a white sock on his back, left leg green enough to still think the rope was an insult rather than a tool. He circled the round pen with his ears pinned and his head high, and Naomi matched him step for step, low-voiced, patient, the way David had taught her before. David wasn't there to teach anyone anything anymore. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. She was also on this particular Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before her wedding, doing it with a bridle strap held together by a knot and good intentions. A stack of unanswered correspondence about flowers and pew ribbons sitting on her kitchen table, and no one else on the property to hand the rope to if her arms gave out. They were not going to give out. She had trained herself past that a long time ago. The colt planted his feet and threw his head so hard the lead line burned across her palm, and she held on anyway because letting go now would cost her 3 days of work. Her boot slid in the dust. She caught herself. She did not call for help because there was no one to call. Need a hand. She hadn't heard him ride up. That alone told her something about him. Most men announced themselves from 50 yards out, wanting credit for the courtesy. This one had simply arrived the way weather arrives, and was now leaning on the top rail of the round pen with his hat pushed back, watching her with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't amusement either. Just attention. "I've got it," Naomi said, which was half true. "Didn't say you didn't." He didn't move to climb the fence. He didn't offer again. He just waited the way you wait for a pot to decide whether it's going to boil, and something in that patience made her loosen her grip on the rope, half a second before the colt would have pulled it clean out of her hands. She looked at him properly then. Younger than she'd first guessed, maybe 30, sun-worn in the way of a man who'd slept under more sky than roof. A saddlebag that had seen better winters. Nothing about him said he intended to stay, and something about that, too, made her trust him more than she trusted men who did. "You hiring?" he asked, when the colt had finally stopped fighting and stood blowing hard at the center of the pen. "I don't have money for hired help." It came out flatter than she meant it. 2 years of saying that sentence to men who assumed a widow needed rescuing had worn a groove into her voice. "Didn't ask about money." He nodded at the colt. "Ask about work." Naomi wiped her palm on her skirt and considered him, and considered the stack of correspondence waiting on her table, and considered the wedding that was coming, whether she'd finished thinking about it or not, and considered, though she would not have admitted this to herself, in daylight, how long it had been since anyone had simply offered to help without first explaining why she needed it. "Room, board, and a horse when the season's done," she said. "That's what I can offer." "That'll do." He said it like he'd have said yes to less. His name was Silas Whitfield. He didn't offer much more than that, and she didn't ask, because in Cedar Hollow, a man's past was his own business until he made it someone else's, and she had learned not to go looking for trouble that wasn't already standing in her yard. He worked the rest of that morning without being told twice about anything, which was new to her. Amos Hartwell, the man she was set to marry inside a month, was a decent man. She reminded herself of that fact. The way she reminded herself of most things, now deliberately, like checking a fence line. But decency and initiative were not the same animal, And Amos had never once in 8 months of courtship shown up at her gate without being asked. By noon, the colt, led on a slack line, and the bridle strap was mended properly, doubled leather instead of a knot. And Naomi stood in her own yard, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel 3 weeks before her wedding. Unaccountably, inconveniently, like she could breathe a little easier than she had that morning. She told herself it was only the extra pair of hands. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the unanswered wedding correspondence in front of her and did not open a single letter. She thought instead about the way Silas Whitfield had waited at the rail instead of climbing over it, and about how Amos, if he'd been there, would have climbed over immediately and taken the rope from her hands without asking, certain that was the kindness she wanted. It wasn't unkindness in either man. She understood that. But there was a particular loneliness in being handled instead of asked, and she had lived inside that loneliness for 2 years now without a name for it, and today, for reasons she was not ready to examine it, finally had one. She banked, the fire blew out the lamp, and lay awake a long while listening to the new sound of someone else's boots on the porch, boards outside Silas doing a last check on the horses, before he turned into the bunk room off the barn, a duty nobody had assigned him. 3 weeks, she told herself. 3 weeks until the wedding, and then this, whatever this quiet, unfamiliar ease would settle back into the shape of ordinary life, the way water settles once the stone has sunk. She did not entirely believe herself, and that more than anything that had happened in the round pen that morning was what kept her awake. By the second week, Naomi had stopped counting how many times Silas Whitfield had fixed something before she'd noticed it was broken. The gate hinge on the north pasture, the leak in the water trough that had been dripping since spring, a loose board on the porch step she'd stepped around so long she'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to give underfoot. None of it announced itself. She would simply find the thing whole one morning and understand without needing to ask whose hands had been on it. Amos Hartwell came calling that Sunday afternoon, as he did most Sundays with his 2 children in tow and his pocket ledger tucked under one arm out of habit rather than necessity. He was a good father, attentive to his children, in a way that spoke well of him. And Naomi watched him settle at her kitchen table and open that ledger to a page headed Household Arrangements, and felt the particular fatigue of a woman being managed by a man who believed managing was the same as caring. "I've written out the guest list by Pew," Amos said, sliding the ledger toward her. "Your side's shorter than mine, but that's no trouble. We'll balance it with the Hartwell cousins from Fredericksburg." "That's fine," Naomi said, because it was, and because there was nothing wrong with a man who planned things thoroughly, and because she had run out some time ago of specific complaints to make about Amos Hartwell that would hold up under examination. His younger daughter, 7 years old and solemn as a judge, tugged Naomi's sleeve and asked, "Would there be cake at the wedding?" And Naomi said yes, of course. And the girl nodded like a transaction had been satisfactorily concluded and went back to playing with the yard cat. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Silas repairing the fence along the south pasture, working alone in the afternoon heat, because she hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't waited to be asked. Amos followed her gaze. "Good man you found," Amos said, not unkindly. "Saves me worrying about the place once you're settled at my house." "Once you're settled at my house." Naomi turned the sentence over in her mind after Amos and the children had gone, turned it over, the way she'd turn a coin to check both faces, and found that it troubled her more than it should have. Not because it was cruel, Amos had not meant it cruelly, had likely not examined it at all before saying it, but because it had not once occurred to him that Ridgeline Ranch might be something she wanted kept, rather than something that would simply cease to need worrying about once she left it behind. She found Silas by the fence line near dusk, sweat-damp, and unhurried, driving the last post with 3 clean strokes of the maul. "You didn't have to finish that today," she said. "Didn't have anything better to do." He set the maul down, and looked at the line of new posts evenly spaced, straighter than the old ones had been. Fence was leaning bad on the east end. Another winter it'd have gone down in the first hard wind. "I know," Naomi said. "I've known for 2 years." He didn't answer that right away, and she was grateful because she hadn't meant to say it with the particular weight it had come out, carrying 2 years of knowing what needed fixing and not having the hands to fix it. 2 years of holding a place together with knots and good intentions. The way she'd held that bridle strap together 3 weeks ago before he'd doubled the leather properly. "You want to walk the rest of the line?" he asked instead, nodding at the pasture stretching west, gold-lit now, with the sun going down behind it. "See what else is leaning." They walked it together, not talking much, and Naomi found she didn't need to fill the silence the way she felt obligated to fill it with Amos, explaining herself, accounting for her choices, softening her competence into something more palatable. Silas simply walked beside her, pointed out a post, here a strand of wire gone slack there, and let the quiet between them do the work that conversation usually had to do. "You're good at this," she said finally, meaning the fence, meaning something larger than the fence. "Had a lot of practice not staying anywhere long enough to leave a thing half done," he said. And there was something underneath it. She didn't press on, not yet, some old weight he carried, the way she carried her own. They reached the end of the fence line as the light went copper and then gray, and stood a moment looking back at the house lamplight, just starting in the kitchen window where she'd left a candle burning. "Thank you," Naomi said, "for today, for all of it." "Wasn't hard," Silas said. "You just had to let somebody." She didn't have an answer for that because it was true in a way that reached further than fence posts, and she walked back to the house alone while he went to check the horses, and she found lying awake again that night that she was doing the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since the round pen 3 weeks ago, not the arithmetic of wedding guests and pew ribbons, but a harder sum entirely, one she did not yet have the courage to finish. The social at Hollow Creek Chapel fell on the third Sunday, and Naomi arrived with a dish made from David's mother's recipe, the one with the cornbread crust, and set it on the long table beside the other offerings. And by the time she'd turned around, 3 women had already taken her by the arm to tell her how sensible she was being. "A woman can't run a place like yours alone forever," said Mrs. Pruitt, who owned the dry goods store and considered herself an authority on most things. "Amos Hartwell is a fine choice. Steady, established. You'll want for nothing." "You'll want for nothing," Naomi repeated, and smiled and thanked her, and felt the words settle over her like a coat 2 sizes too large. Serviceable, warm, even, but not quite shaped to fit. She looked for her dish an hour later, and found it nearly untouched at the end of the table, and told herself it didn't matter that David had been gone 2 years, and the recipe was a small thing to carry into a Sunday social, and still felt something in her chest go tight and quiet, the way it had the day of his funeral, when she'd stood at the graveside doing arithmetic of a different kind. How much land? How many debts? How many mornings alone, and had not let herself cry until everyone had gone home. Across the churchyard she saw Silas. He hadn't come for the social exactly. He'd come because half of Cedar Hollow's ranch hands turned out for the chapel socials, whether or not they attended service drawn by the food and the company, and she watched him help old Mrs. Calvert down from her wagon, offering his arm without being asked, waiting patiently while she gathered her skirts, and then simply walking on afterward without lingering for thanks. He didn't know Naomi was watching. That was the part that stayed with her. "He's a hard worker, they say," said Mrs. Pruitt, following her gaze, her voice carrying the particular delicacy of a woman about to say something less delicate. "Though nobody in the county seems to know where he's from or why he doesn't stay in one place. You want to be careful, Naomi, letting a man like that get too settled on your land so close to your wedding. He's hired help, Mrs. Pruitt. Nothing more needs saying about it. Of course. Of course." Mrs. Pruitt patted her arm in a way that suggested the opposite of agreement and moved off toward the punch table, and Naomi stood alone at the edge of the churchyard, with the particular loneliness of a woman who has just been complimented on a choice she is no longer certain she made honestly. Amos found her there. A few minutes later, his children off chasing something across the grass, and stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the same scene she'd been looking at. "You're quiet today," he said. "Just tired. Wedding'll be a relief once it's past," Amos said, meaning it kindly, meaning it as comfort. "All this planning wears a person down. Once we're settled, you won't have to carry so much on your own. Once we're settled." Naomi turned the phrase over the way she'd turned Amos's other phrase over the week before, "You're settled at my house," and understood with a clarity that arrived unwelcome and would not leave once it had arrived, that Amos imagined marriage as a kind of rescue, a lightening of her load, and had never once asked whether she wanted her load lightened or simply wanted someone to help her carry it as it was. She thought of Silas at the fence line saying, "You just had to let somebody," and the difference between that sentence and Amos's, "You won't have to carry so much," sat in her chest for the rest of the afternoon, heavier than either man could have known. That evening, back at Ridgeline, she found Silas in the barn, checking the mare's feed, and stood in the doorway a moment before he noticed her. "Good social?" he asked. "Mrs. Pruitt thinks you're a mystery and a danger to my reputation," Naomi said more honestly than she'd intended, and was surprised to hear herself laugh, a short, real laugh, the first one in longer than she could easily place. "Mrs. Pruitt's probably right on one count," Silas said, and didn't elaborate, and went back to the feed, and Naomi stood in the doorway, a while longer than the errand required, watching him work, feeling the loneliness of the afternoon give way slowly to something she did not yet have a name for, and was not yet ready to look at directly. The storm came up fast out of the west, the way hill country storms did in early autumn, and by the time Naomi heard the mare's distress from the house, the rain was already coming sideways. She was in the barn before she'd properly thought about it, lantern swinging, and found Delia, the gray mare she'd been most careful with all season, due any day now, down in the straw and struggling. The foal turned wrong inside her, and every year of experience Naomi had told her exactly how much trouble that meant. She thought for one useless half-second of riding to Amos's place a mile off. She thought of him asleep, unreachable in the storm, uninvolved in a crisis he didn't yet know existed, and understood, in that same half-second, that there was no time for it, and no real use in it either. Silas was already there. He must have heard the mare too, or felt the change in the barn, the way people who'd spent their lives around animals sometimes did, because he came through the door, soaked to the skin, took one look at Delia, and was on his knees in the straw beside Naomi before she'd finished saying his name. "Breach," he said. "Not a question." "I know. Then you know what we've got to do." He was already rolling up his sleeves, already reaching for the length of rope hung by the stall door, and something in his calm steadied her more than any words could have. The next hour was the hardest kind of work there was, hands slick with rain and effort, reaching, turning, coaxing. A foal that did not want to be born, the easy way into a position where it could be born at all. Delia crying out, in the particular voice horses used only when the pain outran their patience, the lantern throwing wild shadows against the barn wall every time the wind found the door. They did not speak much. There wasn't room in the work for speaking, but there was a rhythm they fell into without discussing it. Silas's strength where strength was needed. Naomi's steadier hands where the work called for gentleness. Each of them reading what the other needed before it was asked, the way she imagined a marriage might work, if she'd ever seen one built that way up close. The foal came just before dawn, wet and impossibly long-legged and alive, and Delia, exhausted, turned her head to nose at it with the specific, uncomplicated relief of a mother who has survived something. Naomi sat back in the straw, soaked through arms, trembling, and found she had no words at all for what she was feeling, and looked over to find Silas in the same state beside her watching the foal find its feet. "Well," he said, "that's one more that made it." She laughed, the second real laugh in a week, and this one came out closer to a sob than the first had and pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes. And when she lowered it, Silas was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something unguarded that he seemed to notice a half-second after she did and pulled back behind his usual quiet. Without entirely deciding to, she reached over and rested her hand on his shoulder. Not a dramatic gesture, nothing more than what two exhausted people share after surviving a hard night together. And yet it was she understood, even as she did it, the first touch either of them had allowed themselves, that wasn't accidental, that wasn't explainable by the work. He didn't move away from it. He didn't make more of it than it was either. He simply let it there a moment, the two of them breathing in the gray barn light, with a newborn foal finding its legs in front of them. And then Naomi drew her hand back, and they finished the morning's chores, in a silence that felt entirely different from the silence they'd started the night in. She rode to Amos's place after breakfast, to explain why her boots were still caked with barn mud, why she looked as though she hadn't slept, and found herself giving him the barest version of the night's events. A mare foaled hard, we managed it, and watching his concern arrive a beat too late and land a degree too shallow, more relief that the crisis was past than curiosity about what it had cost her to get through it. She rode home more slowly than she'd ridden out, and did not examine closely why the barn at Ridgeline felt more like where she wanted to be than the tidy, well-managed house a mile off ever had. She found the photograph while clearing out the tack room, tucked behind a broken bridle she'd meant to throw away a year ago and never had. David, 26 years old, in the picture, squinting into the sun outside the barn he'd built with his own hands, water-spotted now at one corner, where damp had gotten in sometime over the years. Naomi sat down on an overturned feed bucket and looked at it a long while, not crying. Just still, the particular stillness of a woman visiting a grief she'd learned to carry quietly rather than one she'd learned to set down. She didn't hear Silas come in until he was already in the doorway, and she didn't move to hide the photograph, which surprised her. She'd hidden this particular grief from Amos for 2 years, packaged it into acceptable phrases like, "It's been hard, and I still think of him sometimes," careful never to let it take up more room than a widow's grief was permitted to take. "That him?" Silas asked, quiet, not stepping closer than the doorway allowed. "That's him." She held it out, and he crossed the room and crouched down to look careful with it, the way he was careful with everything. "Good-looking man. How was?" She took the photograph back and turned it over in her hands. "Horse threw him. 2 years ago this October. I'd told him to hire help for that particular animal. The horse had a reputation, everyone knew it, and he did it himself instead because that was who he was, and I let him, because arguing with David about what he could and couldn't handle never once worked in 11 years of marriage." She hadn't said that much of it out loud to anyone, not even to Amos, who knew the shape of the story, but not the guilt folded inside it, the 2 years she'd spent since believing that if she'd pushed harder, insisted rather than suggested, David might still be alive, and that the only sensible response to that particular kind of failure was never to need anyone's help again. Silas was quiet a moment, and then he said in the plain, unhurried way he said most things, "I had a brother, younger than me by 4 years. I was supposed to be watching the North Stock when the flood came through our place in Missouri. I was 17, thought I knew better than my father about where the water would rise to. Wasn't watching close enough. Lost half the herd and lost my brother trying to get them out of the low pasture before I could stop him." Naomi looked up at him and understood, in the way one understands a thing suddenly rather than gradually, why a man who was this good at staying this careful with fences, this patient with a frightened colt, this steady in a barn at 3 in the morning, had spent a decade making sure he never stayed anywhere long enough to be responsible for it. My father never said it was my fault, Silas went on. Didn't have to. I left within the year. Told myself I was going where the work was. Truth is, I couldn't stand being somewhere that reminded me every day what I hadn't watched closely enough. That's not the same as what happened with David, Naomi said. No, Silas agreed. But it rhymes. They sat with that, a while, the tack room dim and smelling of leather and dust, two people who had each spent years believing their own particular grief made them unfit to be trusted with anyone's safety but their own. And something in the shared silence felt less like the comfortable quiet they'd built over the past weeks and more like being fully seen by another person for the first time in longer than either of them could easily say. I don't tell people that, Silas said finally. About my brother. I don't tell people about the horse, Naomi said. About telling David to hire help and not making him listen. Maybe we just told the wrong people up till now. She looked at him a long moment and did not have words yet for what was happening between them. Only the certainty that whatever it was, it had moved past the point where she could keep calling it hired help and a helpful pair of hands. She set the photograph carefully back where she'd found it, not hidden this time, just kept, and they walked out of the tack room together into the ordinary gold light of the afternoon. And nothing more was said, because nothing more needed to be, and that too was new. Amos hosted dinner the following Sunday, a formal enough occasion that he'd asked his sister to help with the cooking, and Naomi arrived with the children's favorite molasses cookies, and a feeling in her chest she couldn't quite place until she was seated at his table and understood what it was rehearsal. This was what her life was going to look like every Sunday for as long as she lived. Amos's daughter, 7 and solemn, asked Naomi to pass the biscuits in precisely the tone she'd have used with any adult at the table. Polite, expectant entirely, without the particular warmth a child reserves for someone she's beginning to think of as hers. Naomi passed the biscuits and told herself the warmth would come with time, the way Amos assured her most things would come with time, and did not entirely believe it. I've spoken to the minister about the readings, Amos said over the roast in the same tone he'd have used to report on a cattle sale. He suggested the passage from Ruth seemed fitting given the circumstances. That's a good choice, Naomi said, because it was, and because she had stopped some weeks back offering opinions of her own on the wedding's particulars, since Amos generally arrived at each decision already made and simply informed her of it as a courtesy. His younger son, 4 years old, asked whether Naomi would live with them now, and Amos answered before Naomi could, saying, yes, once we're married, Naomi will run our household. And Naomi sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about the word run, and how differently it had sounded from Amos's mouth than it had sounded 3 weeks ago from Silas standing at the round pen rail, asking need a hand, as though the running of Ridgeline was hers to keep, not hers to hand over. She thought about the silence at this table, comfortable in its own way, orderly, the silence of a household that functioned smoothly because everyone in it knew their assigned place and set it without meaning to against the silence she and Silas had built over the past month, the kind that didn't need filling because two people were already understood without needing to explain themselves. One silence felt like being managed kindly. The other felt like being known. She did not say this to Amos because there was nothing unkind in what he'd built, nothing she could point to and call a fault, only an absence she'd spent 2 years telling herself she didn't need filled and had begun against her own careful planning to want filled anyway. You're quiet tonight, Amos said as she was leaving, standing at his gate in the blue dusk with his children already called in for bed. Long week, Naomi said, which was true and not the truth he was asking for. Only a few more weeks now, Amos said, and there was real warmth in it, He was, she reminded herself again, a genuinely kind man, offering her the life he believed she wanted, the safety the whole county agreed a widow ought to want. "You'll be glad of the rest once you're settled," she rode, home in the dark, with his words trailing behind her, like something caught on a fence post. And when she reached Ridgeline, the kitchen window was lit, and through it she could see the stack of wedding invitations still sitting exactly where she'd left them 3 days ago, unaddressed, unfinished. And she sat on the porch step a long while before going in, unable for reasons she was no longer willing to pretend she didn't understand, to make herself pick them up. The marriage banns went up at Hollow Creek Chapel on a bright ordinary Wednesday, and a child of 9 read them aloud to a knot of curious onlookers, with the solemn self-importance of a boy who has been handed a genuine responsibility. And just like that, the wedding stopped being a private matter. Naomi could quietly reconsider and became a fact the whole county had witnessed. She stood at the edge of the churchyard, listening to her own name read out beside Amos Hartwell's, and felt the particular vertigo of hearing a decision spoken back to you by a stranger's child, as though it belonged now to the town rather than to her. Amos's older sister Delphine cornered her by the chapel steps not 10 minutes later. "I understand you've kept that drifter on through the wedding season," Delphine said in the specific tone of a woman who has rehearsed her concern as courtesy. "People do talk, Naomi. A single man so close to your own house, so near your wedding, you'll want to think of how it looks, if not how it is. He's hired help same as any season," Naomi said, and heard even as she said it how thin the sentence had worn from repetition. "Of course," Delphine said, in the same tone Mrs. Pruitt had used weeks before, and moved off toward the churchyard, leaving Naomi standing with the bands fluttering on the chapel door behind her, and a knot in her chest that had nothing to do with reputation, and everything to do with the fact that Delphine, without meaning to, had said the truest thing anyone had said to her all month. She rode, home troubled, and did not entirely settle by the time she reached the barn where Silas was mending a strap of tack by lamplight, unhurried, unaware yet of what had happened at the chapel. "Banns went up today," she said from the doorway. He looked up. Something crossed his face, not surprised. She didn't think more like a fact landing that he'd known was coming and had been quietly bracing for. "Guess that makes it official then." "Guess it does." She came and sat on the overturned bucket across from him, the same bucket she'd sat on in the tack room weeks before, and watched his hands work the leather steady as they always were, though something in the set of his shoulders had changed. "Delphine Hartwell thinks it doesn't look right," Naomi said. "You staying on this close to the wedding. She's not wrong that it'll get talked about." "That's not what I asked." Silas set the strap down and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the lamp between them throwing long shadows up the barn wall. The particular held silence of two people standing at the edge of something they'd both been circling for a month without naming. "Naomi," he started, and something in the way he said her name, plain and unguarded, without the careful distance he usually kept in his voice, made her chest go tight with a hope she hadn't given herself permission to feel. The barn door banged open. Amos's youngest, who'd ridden over with his father on some errand about the pews, came skidding in asking whether Naomi had seen his ball, and the moment broke apart. The way held breath breaks apart when someone finally speaks, and Silas looked away, first back down at the tack in his hands, and said nothing more. Naomi found the ball under the hay wagon and handed it to the boy, and sent him back out. And when she turned around, Silas was still bent over the strap, working it with more attention than the mended leather required, and the sentence he'd started did not get finished that night or the night after. But she had heard the way he'd said her name, and she carried it with her up to the house and lay awake a long while turning it over, understanding, with the same unwelcome clarity that had visited her at the church social and again at Amos's dinner table, that whatever had almost been said in the barn had not disappeared simply because it went unfinished. It had only gone on waiting, the way most true things did for the moment, Someone found the courage to pick it back up. She found him in the barn 3 days later, with his saddlebag half packed on the bench beside him, and understood before he said a single word exactly what she was looking at. "There's a ranch 2 counties over, needs a hand through the winter," Silas said, not meeting her eyes, at first folding a shirt with more care than the task required. "Man named Herschel Boyd. Good outfit, steady pay. I told him I'd start end of the week." "You didn't mention it," Naomi said. "Wasn't sure how to." She stood in the doorway, with her arms crossed, holding herself the way she'd held herself through 2 years of standing at gravesides and bank counters and church socials, upright out of long practice, rather than out of any particular strength she felt at the moment. "This is about what Delphine said, about how it looks. It's about what's true," Silas said, and finally looked up at her, and there was nothing evasive in it, only the plain, unhurried honesty she'd come to know as entirely his. "You're getting married in 2 weeks, Naomi. I've spent a month telling myself I was just hired help, and it was true right up until it wasn't, and I don't figure it does either of us any good, me standing in your barn a few days shy of your wedding, saying things a wife doesn't need to hear from anybody but her husband. Amos isn't—" She started and stopped, because she didn't know how to finish that sentence honestly, not standing here, not with the saddlebag already half-packed on the bench between them. "I know he's a good man," Silas said. "I've watched him a month, same as you have. I'm not leaving because I think poorly of him. I'm leaving because staying wouldn't be fair to either one of you, and because I've spent 10 years leaving before I could do more damage than good to people who trusted me, and I don't know how to be anything but what I've always been." She wanted badly to ask him to stay. The want rose up in her chest with a force that frightened her. She had spent 2 years training herself never to ask anyone for anything, never to need a thing out loud, where it could be refused, or worse, granted, out of pity rather than desire. And she found standing in the barn doorway, with the evening light going long and gold behind her, that she could not make herself say it. So she said nothing. He finished packing, in a silence she recognized, because it was the same silence she'd offered him the restraint of 2 people who had each spent years protecting themselves from wanting things they weren't certain they were allowed to have. "You've done more for this place in a month than," she started, and her voice caught, and she made herself finish it plainly the way he would have. "Than I've let myself accept from anyone in 2 years. I won't forget that." "Wasn't hard," Silas said, echoing what he'd told her weeks ago at the fence line, and this time there was something raw underneath it. "Wasn't hard at all, Naomi. That's the trouble." He rode out, at first light the next morning, and she stood on the porch and watched him go upright, compose the same posture that had carried her through every hard thing since David died, and did not let herself cry until the dust of his horse had settled entirely, and there was no one left on the road to see it. The house was unbearably quiet after that. Not the ordinary quiet she'd lived inside for 2 years and learned to call peace. A different quiet, a wrong-shaped one. The kind that told her more plainly than anything Delphine Hartwell or Mrs. Pruitt, or even Amos himself, had managed to say exactly how much space 1 month had carved out in her life, and exactly how much emptier that space felt now than it had before it was filled. She did not sleep the night Silas left, and she did not sleep well the 2 nights after, and on the 3rd morning she saddled her own horse before dawn, without deciding to in any way she could have explained afterward, and rode to Amos Hartwell's ranch while the light was still gray. He met her at his own gate, surprised to see her so early, his children not yet up, the household still holding the particular stillness of a house before its day begins. "Naomi, is something wrong?" "I need to talk with you," she said, "and I need to do it plainly, because you deserve plain, and I haven't been plain with you in longer than I'm proud of." He led her to his kitchen and put coffee on, and she sat across from him at the table where his children ate their meals and did their sums, and made herself say the thing she'd spent 3 sleepless nights arranging into words that wouldn't wound him more than the truth already would. "I said yes to you because it made sense," she said. "Because the whole county agreed a woman shouldn't run a place alone forever, and because you are a genuinely good man. And because saying yes felt like the responsible thing to do after 2 years of people telling me what I owed myself and what I owed appearances. I don't think I ever once asked myself what I wanted separate from what was sensible." Amos was quiet, a moment turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, and when he spoke there was more relief in his voice than hurt, which surprised her less than she'd expected it to. "I've felt it too," he said. "Truth told, I asked you the way I'd have hired a good foreman, sound reasoning, sensible arrangement. I told myself that was enough because I didn't much believe after Sarah passed that I'd feel anything more than that again, and I was grateful to find someone I respected enough to make do with sensible." "You deserve more than someone making do," Naomi said. "So do you." He looked at her steadily, and there was no anger in it at all, only a kind of tired, honest recognition. "I've watched you this month, Naomi. Watched how you talk about that ranch of yours, and how you don't talk that way about our wedding. I told myself I didn't see it, because I didn't want to have to start over. I expect I've known longer than either of us wanted to say out loud." She took the ring from her finger and set it gently on the table between them, not pressed into his hand, not an accusation, only a return, and he looked at it a moment before nodding slow and accepting the nod of a man laying down a weight he'd been carrying without quite admitting how heavy it had gotten. "I'm sorry," Naomi said, "for the time it took me to be honest." "Don't be sorry for choosing true over safe," Amos said. "It's a braver thing than most people manage. I hope whoever it is you're not saying his name to just yet, he knows what he's getting." She rode, home with the ring gone from her hand, and a lightness in her chest she hadn't expected, mixed with a grief of its own kind for the sensible life she'd almost lived for Amos's kindness for 2 years, of telling herself that safety and happiness were the same thing simply because safety was easier to plan for. But beneath the grief and the lightness both sat a harder truth, one that had been waiting for her the whole ride home. Ending the engagement had not brought Silas Whitfield back. He was 2 counties over by now, working another man's stock, believing he'd done the responsible thing by leaving before he could do any damage, and she had let him go without a single word to stop him. She stood in her own empty barn that evening, the same barn where a mare had foaled hard in a storm, where an old photograph had been set down unhidden for the first time in 2 years, where a saddlebag had sat half-packed on a bench 3 days before, and understood that ending one kind of waiting had only made room for a harder one to begin. She left before dawn and rode 2 counties over on the strength of a name, Herschel Boyd, and a description of his spread that a neighbor's hired man had given her the day before, half-remembered directions over dry creek beds, and past a burned-out line shack that had apparently stood as a landmark for a decade. She found the Boyd place a little past noon, and found Silas in the corral, exactly where she'd known, somehow, that she would find him, working a green colt, with the same patient, low-voiced care he'd used on her own chestnut, a month before, waiting at the rail of himself. The way he waited at the rail of every frightened thing, letting it come to him rather than forcing the matter. He saw her before she'd dismounted, and went still in a way that told her he hadn't expected this, hadn't let himself expect it. The same careful bracing she recognized from her own 2 years of not letting herself expect anything good to last. Naomi. Just her name, the way he'd said it in the barn the night the bands went up unguarded. "I'm not marrying Amos," she said, because there was no sense easing into it, not after riding half a day to say it. "I gave him back the ring 3 days ago. I should have done it the morning you left, but I was still telling myself I could keep being sensible about this, and it took me until this morning to understand I've been out of sensible for a good while now. Silas set down the lead rope and came to the rail, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the same held quiet that had broken apart in the barn doorway weeks before, except there was no child bursting in. This time, no errand to interrupt them, nothing left standing between the thing that wanted saying and the saying of it. "I told you once, you just had to let somebody," Naomi said, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected it to be, steadier than 2 years of guarding herself had any right to leave it. "I've spent 2 years not letting anybody. Told myself it was strength. I think more honestly, it was just fear wearing strength's clothes. You asked me a question in my own yard a month ago, and I gave you the answer I'd had ready for 2 years, and it wasn't the true one." "What's the true one?" Silas asked, quiet, careful, giving her the same room at the rail he'd given every frightened thing he'd ever gentled. "I've needed a hand for years," Naomi whispered. "Not weeks, years. I just didn't have the courage to say so out loud to anyone who might actually stay long enough to give it." Something moved through his face, then the particular unguarded thing she'd seen once before in the gray barn light, after the mare foaled, and this time he didn't let it retreat behind his usual careful distance. He came around the rail and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the dust of a month's honest work on him, close enough that whatever answer he gave next would have nowhere to hide. "I've spent 10 years leaving before I could do more harm than good," he said. "Told myself that was responsibility. I think more honestly, it was the same fear as yours, just wearing a saddlebag instead of a wedding ring." He reached out, slow, deliberate, and took her hand, not the way Amos had once taken it, managing, deciding, but the way he'd taken the rope from her that first morning, only after she'd already loosened her own grip. I don't want to leave anymore, Naomi. Not this place, not you. I've been running from the idea that I could be trusted with something worth keeping, and I'd like to stop if you'll let me." "I'm asking you to," she said. "That's the difference. I'm asking." He kissed her there, in the dust of Herschel Boyd's corral, gentle. At first, the way a man kisses someone he's been thinking about for a month and wants to get right. And she kissed him back with the full, unguarded conviction of a woman who had finally stopped confusing safety with happiness, and somewhere behind them, the green colt shifted and blew out a breath, and went back to grazing, entirely unbothered by the two people who'd just stopped running from the same thing at the same time. They rode back to Ridgeline together. 3 days later, Silas leading the young horse he'd been gentling, a parting gift from Herschel Boyd, who said he'd never seen a man work so hard for so short a season, and figured he owed him something for it, and found waiting at the gate a short note from Amos delivered by his eldest boy. "I hope you've found what you were looking for. The children ask after you kindly. Come to supper sometime once the dust settles as friends." There was no bitterness in it, only the same plain decency Amos had shown her the whole 8 months she'd known him, and Naomi folded the note and kept it, grateful in the way you're grateful for a kindness that cost the other person more than they let you see. That evening on the porch of Ridgeline Ranch, Naomi sat beside Silas Whitfield in the last gold light of an ordinary Texas evening. The fence lines mended the barn, steady the ranch, no longer a thing. She held up alone by force of habit and stubbornness, and understood that the question he'd asked her a month ago in the round pen had never really been about the colt at all. "Need a hand?" he asked again, now holding his out to her on the porch step, the smallest private joke between two people who finally understood each other completely. "I've needed one for years," Naomi said, and took it.
That's the whole of it. A widow who mistook safety for the only kind of love left available to her, and a rifter who mistook living for the only kindness he had left to give, and the slow, patient month it took for both of them to learn better. What stayed with me isn't the wedding that didn't happen, or the one that eventually did. It's the question itself. need a hand, ask plainly without demanding an answer, and offer again and again until someone finally feels safe enough to say yes. I think about Amos too, more than you might expect from a man who doesn't get the girl. It takes its own kind of courage to recognize a sensible arrangement isn't the same as a true one, and to let someone go with kindness instead of revenge. Not every good man in this story had to close to be honorable. Where are you watching from tonight? Rub your city and state, or your country. If you found your way to us from somewhere further out in the comments below, I read everyone. And I'm always a little amazed at how far Texas strange story travels. If this one found you at the right moment, I hope you like it, surprise and stay close. There's another story coming soon, and I would love for you to be here when it arrives. Until next time, keep needing a hand, and keep having the courage to say no, to say so.